In the spring of 1943, over the war-torn skies of Europe, the German Luftwaffe still ruled with confidence. Their sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s and agile Focke-Wulf 190s had torn through almost everything the Allies could send against them. But when word spread that the Americans were deploying a new fighter called the P-47 Thunderbolt, German pilots laughed. They called it the Flying Milk Jug, a massive, barrel-shaped aircraft, heavier than anything they had ever seen take off for combat. Its enormous radial engine and thick wings made it look slow and clumsy compared to their refined, elegant machines. Even some American pilots doubted it at first, whispering that it was too big to dogfight and too heavy to climb. On airfields in England, young American pilots stared at their new mounts with mixed feelings. The P-47 dwarfed every other fighter on the tarmac. It weighed over 8 tons fully loaded, nearly twice as much as a Spitfire. To many, it looked more like a bomber than a fighter. "Are we supposed to fight in this thing?" one pilot joked. "Or live in it?" The Germans weren't joking. When their reconnaissance units reported sightings of the new Thunderbolt, Luftwaffe intelligence dismissed it as an easy target. In their reports, they described it as a heavy escort fighter, slow in climb and maneuver. For the German High Command, it was just another problem soon to be solved by the skill of their seasoned aces. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind the thick armor and the massive fuselage lay the most powerful piston engine of its time, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, capable of over 2,000 horsepower. Could push the Thunderbolt to altitudes no Bf 109 could easily reach. Still, during its first missions in early 1943, the skepticism persisted. The P-47s were assigned to bomber escort duty, but their limited range meant they could only protect the bombers halfway to Germany. Many never returned. German pilots bragged over radio chatter, mocking the new American machine. One Luftwaffe ace reportedly said, "They build tractors, not fighters." In the first weeks of combat, they had some reason to believe it. P-47 units struggled with radio issues and inexperience. Their attacks were clumsy, their coordination poor. Several Thunderbolts were lost without scoring a single kill. But each loss was a lesson. By May, American engineers had improved the aircraft's turbocharger system, giving it incredible high-altitude performance. Its dive speed was unmatched. The Thunderbolt could dive at over 500 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could follow without breaking apart. And when it pulled out of that dive, those 8.50 caliber machine guns roared like thunder. Still, in this early stage of the war, the German pilots didn't see that coming. They mocked the plane from the safety of their cockpits until they met it head-on. One story survives from that time, an encounter between a young German ace, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Meyer, and the 56 Fighter Group near the English Channel. Meyer spotted a formation of P-47s escorting bombers and dove to attack, confident he'd catch one of those fat American pigs. He fired a burst, hitting a Thunderbolt's wing. The P-47 rolled, dived straight down, and Meyer followed, grinning. At 20,000 feet, he began to lose control. His FW-190 started to shake violently. The Thunderbolt just kept diving, stable as a rock. When the German finally pulled up, his wings nearly tore off. The P-47 leveled out below the clouds, untouched, and then climbed back toward him with frightening speed. That day, Meyer barely escaped. His report later described the American plane as unusually fast in descent, potentially dangerous. Slowly, the laughter began to fade. The American pilots of the 56th and 78th Fighter Groups learned to use the Thunderbolt strengths. Its dive speed, its rugged armor, and its brutal firepower. They didn't try to outturn the Germans. They outdove them, outlasted them, and hit them harder than anyone thought possible. The P-47 could take hits that would tear apart a Spitfire and still bring its pilot home. Yet, in these early days, this first chapter of the Thunderbolt's legend, it was still an underdog. Every mission felt like a gamble, every encounter a test. The Germans mocked it from the ground and the air, calling it a flying bathtub, a joke, a waste of metal. But behind every joke was a flicker of fear, a realization that this big, ugly American machine was surviving hits no other plane could. And its pilots, once skeptical themselves, were beginning to see what the Thunderbolt really was. A beast waking up, a storm gathering above Europe. Soon, those who laughed at it would learn its true name, not Jug, not Tractor, but Thunderbolt, the sound that followed before the rain of lead came down. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a symbol of raw, unstoppable power in the skies over Europe. Its massive engine growled like thunder, but what truly made it feared, what turned it from a machine into a legend, were the 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in its wings. For on each side, 8 barrels of destruction, over 3,400 rounds of armor-piercing firepower that could shred anything unlucky enough to be in their path. Each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute. Together, they unleashed nearly 7,000 bullets every 60 seconds. A storm of lead so dense that pilots said it looked like a solid beam of metal. When a Thunderbolt squeezed the trigger, the recoil shook the whole aircraft, the wings trembling with fury. At first, these guns had been chosen almost by accident. In 1940, when Alexander Kartveli and his team were designing the P-47, they realized the plane's heavy weight meant it could carry much more armament than any previous fighter. The .50 caliber Browning M2, the same weapon used on bombers and tanks, was the obvious choice. It offered a perfect balance of range, fire rate, and sheer destructive power. By the time the P-47 entered combat, these guns had already earned a terrifying reputation. A single burst could tear the wing off a German Bf-109 or slice through the engine block of a Focke-Wulf 190. But what made them truly deadly was how the Thunderbolt's pilots learned to use them. Men like Hub Zemke, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and Robert S. Johnson turned the P-47 into a weapon of precision slaughter. They would dive from high altitude, line up their targets, and fire short, controlled bursts. The 8 guns roared in unison, a thunderclap that echoed across the sky. German pilots soon learned to fear that sound. Survivors described it as a hammering storm, like tearing canvas and thunder mixed together. Those who weren't torn apart by the bullets often bailed out seconds later, their aircraft engulfed in flame. One of the most famous stories came from Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group. In June 1943, during a mission over France, Johnson's P-47 was ambushed by a Focke-Wulf 190. His canopy was shattered, fuel leaking, engine hit, but the Thunderbolt refused to die. The German pilot circled back again and again, emptying his guns. Johnson's plane was riddled with over 200 holes, yet it stayed in the air. Finally, as the German flew alongside to finish the kill, Johnson squeezed his own trigger. The 8.50s exploded to life, and the FW-190 disintegrated under the hail of bullets. Johnson limped home, his aircraft soaked in oil, but alive. When his crew counted the hits, they found bullets embedded in the cockpit armor, the engine, even the radio, but the P-47 had brought its pilot back. Stories like that spread quickly. The Thunderbolt's guns became a symbol of survival as much as destruction. American bomber crews loved to see them overhead. They knew that when the jugs arrived, the Luftwaffe scattered. But the 8.50s weren't just for air combat. In 1944, as the Allies pushed deeper into France after D-Day, Thunderbolts began flying ground attack missions. Here, their true power was unleashed. Flying low over the countryside, they hunted German trains, trucks, and tanks. Their guns ripped through armored vehicles like paper. One pilot described strafing a convoy. "I came down at 300 miles per hour. I could see the tracers walking across the road. Trucks exploded. Men jumped for cover. It was chaos in seconds. Each mission left the landscape scarred with burning wrecks and craters. The Germans called it Der Schwarze-Tod, the Black Death. The combination of speed, armor, and firepower made the P-47 the ultimate ground attack aircraft of the war. Even tanks feared it. The .50 caliber bullets, when fired in concentrated bursts, could penetrate engine decks and fuel tanks. And when combined with bombs and rockets, the Thunderbolt became a flying artillery piece. American commanders quickly realized this. They assigned entire groups of P-47s to tactical air support, striking enemy lines, supply trains, and even troop concentrations ahead of advancing Allied forces. The roar of their engines and the staccato thunder of their guns became the soundtrack of liberation across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. To the soldiers on the ground, the sound was unforgettable. One infantryman later said, "When you heard that deep growl overhead and the guns started talking, you knew the jugs were on your side. It meant you were going to live another day." By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. German pilots still fought bravely, but their ranks were thinning, their fuel scarce. Against the Thunderbolt's 8 Brownings, few stood a chance. The air war had shifted. The Hunter had become unstoppable. Every time a P-47 dove from the clouds, it carried the weight of America's industrial might. Thousands of bullets forged in factories, shipped across oceans, loaded into wings, and unleashed in seconds. It wasn't elegance that won the air war. It was relentless power. The 8.50s of the Thunderbolt embodied that power. They spoke with the voice of a nation determined to end the war, one burst at a time. And in those brief, thunderous seconds when the triggers were pulled, the skies of Europe belonged to the Jug. By early 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt was ready for war. In February, the first combat-ready squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force assembled in England cold, muddy, and restless. The airfields of East Anglia were filled with strange new aircraft. Enormous, silver-bodied fighters that dwarfed the sleek British Spitfires parked beside them. The British pilots called it the Jug, half as a joke, half as a warning. The American pilots who arrived from training bases back home were still learning what their new machine could really do. Many had never even flown over enemy territory. Now they were about to take the fight deep into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The first P-47 units, the 4th Fighter Group, 56th Fighter Group, and 78th Fighter Group, began operational flights in March 1943. Their mission: to protect the lumbering B-17 and B-24 bombers that were carrying the war to Germany. But there was a problem. The Thunderbolt's fuel range was limited. It could only escort the bombers partway, usually as far as the Belgian coast or the Dutch border. Beyond that, the bombers were on their own, easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Still, morale was high. The Americans believed that the Thunderbolt's sheer speed and firepower would be enough to turn the tide. On their first escort missions, they encountered small groups of German fighters testing the new intruders. Radio chatter was nervous, full of code words and warnings. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Angels, 25. Thunderbolts, keep tight. The first combat victory for AP-47 came on April 15, 1943, when Major Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group downed a Focke-Wulf 190 over France. It was a short, brutal engagement, one that ended with a burst of 8.50 caliber guns and a German plane spiraling into the Channel. The victory was symbolic. The big American tractor, as German pilots had mocked it, could fight and win, but success didn't come easily. Many early missions were plagued by technical failures. Radio interference caused entire formations to lose contact. The turbo-supercharger overheated at low altitude, and when the Thunderbolts returned from their missions, they often landed with fuel gauges close to zero. Yet, through every challenge, pilots learned to trust their aircraft. The P-47 was heavy, but it could dive like a meteor. In those dives, pilots found their advantage. German fighters would chase them down, only to see the Thunderbolt pull away effortlessly, its massive frame slicing through the air with terrifying stability. One pilot described it later. You could dive so fast in a jug that the world blurred into streaks of blue and brown, and when you leveled out, you were still in one piece. As the weeks turned to months, the P-47s grew deadlier. Engineers at the Republic factory back in New York worked tirelessly to add drop tanks, external fuel containers that could extend the range by hundreds of miles. With them, the Thunderbolts could finally follow the bombers deeper into enemy territory, confronting the Luftwaffe head-on. By mid-1943, the skies over France and the Low Countries had become a daily battlefield. Every morning, waves of B-17s rose from English airfields, escorted by their P-47 Guardians. The Germans responded with their best, the Bf-109s and Fw-190s from elite Jägerschwader squadrons. The encounters were furious, often lasting less than a minute. At 25,000 feet, tracer fire lit up the sky like sparks in a storm. Radios crackled with clipped voices, mixed with static and fear. Thunderbolts, break! Break! Bogey on your 6. He's smoking. You got him. The Thunderbolt's reputation began to change. German intelligence reports started describing it as fast in dive, dangerous in pursuit, extremely durable. Stories spread through Luftwaffe bases of P-47s returning to England with holes the size of fists in their wings. Still flying steady, still shooting back. Among those early groups, none became more famous than the 56th Fighter Group, led by the charismatic Hub Zemke. Zemke was a tactical genius who understood the Thunderbolt's true strengths. He taught his men not to dogfight like Spitfire pilots, but to fight like hunters, to dive, strike, and climb away before the enemy could react. Never turn with a 190, he told them. Hit hard, then leave him wondering what happened. Under Zemke's command, the 56th became the most successful Thunderbolt group of the war, racking up hundreds of kills. Their emblem, a red circle with a fierce wolf's head, became a symbol of American air power across Europe. By late 1943, the laughter of German pilots had faded. They now watched the skies with caution, scanning for the glint of sunlight off a P-47's wings. The juggernaut was no longer a curiosity. It was a storm spreading across occupied Europe. In every mission, Thunderbolts escorted bombers deeper, struck airfields, and strafed trains and convoys below. Their engines roared through the clouds, leaving trails of smoke and fear in their wake. The skies were no longer safe for the Reich. But this was only the beginning. The real transformation, the moment when the P-47 would become the ultimate terror of the Luftwaffe, was still ahead. For now, as 1943 drew to a close, the Thunderbolt had carved its place in the war. A symbol of American might, a sound that meant survival for bombers and doom for their enemies. Into the skies of Europe, the juggernaut had arrived. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. The once dominant German Luftwaffe, the terror of 1940, was now fighting for survival. And one aircraft above all had helped bring about that transformation: the P-47 Thunderbolt. At first, the Germans had laughed. They had mocked the big, barrel-bodied fighter as the flying milk jug. But after a year of brutal air combat, laughter had turned into silence, and silence into fear. Luftwaffe radio intercepts began to mention the heavy American fighter, that could dive faster than any German plane and return home riddled with bullets yet still flying. Reports from downed pilots described encounters with a machine that refused to break, whose guns could tear apart armor and steel in seconds. Slowly, the word spread through German airfields: avoid head-on fights with the Thunderbolt. The P-47 had earned its respect the hard way. By mid-1944, Allied forces had landed in Normandy. The invasion of France depended on complete air superiority. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to contest the skies, but the Americans now had thousands of fighters, and the Thunderbolt was at the center of it all. Day after day, squadrons of Jugs took off from hastily built airstrips in England and later in France, roaring low over hedgerows and villages. They bombed bridges, strafed convoys, and destroyed rail lines that supplied German troops. Wherever the Wehrmacht moved, the Thunderbolt followed, like a relentless predator in the sky. German soldiers began to recognize the deep growl of its engine long before they could see it. One eyewitness from the 12th Panzer Division later wrote, "When we heard that roar, we knew it was the Thunderbolt. You could hide under trees, but it didn't matter. When it opened fire, it was as if the world exploded around you." For Allied pilots, the respect of their enemies came at a terrible price. Every mission meant flying into the teeth of flak and ground fire. The black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky, shredding wings and tearing through engines. But the P-47 could take punishment like no other. Pilots often returned with wings full of holes, control cables severed, and oil leaking across the windshield. Yet somehow, the Jug kept them alive. One story became legendary among airmen. In late 1944, Lieutenant Bill Dunham of the 348th Fighter Group encountered a lone Japanese Ki-43 Oscar over the Philippines. Though this was in the Pacific, his story echoed through every P-47 squadron. Dunham shot down the enemy plane, but as he circled, he saw the Japanese pilot parachuting. Instead of firing again, Dunham dropped his life raft toward him, a rare gesture of mercy in a brutal war. That moment captured what the Thunderbolt had come to represent. Not just power, but discipline, skill, and humanity. Even German pilots, proud of their own machines, began to speak of the Thunderbolt with reluctant admiration. Some called it Der Panzerjäger der Luft, the tank hunter of the skies. Others described it as a fortress with wings. They no longer mocked it, they respected it. Among the most respected Thunderbolt units was the 56th Fighter Group, still under the leadership of Colonel Hub Zemke. His pilots, including Francis Gaby Gabreski and Robert S. Johnson, had become aces many times over. They dominated the skies of Western Europe, destroying hundreds of enemy aircraft and countless ground targets. Zemke's philosophy had shaped a generation of fighter pilots. Hit fast, hit hard, and survive to fight again. The respect extended beyond the enemy. Allied bomber crews spoke of the P-47 with almost reverence. When the formations of Thunderbolts appeared above the bombers, the men inside the B-17s felt a surge of relief. They knew those big American fighters would stay until the very last possible moment, diving into danger to protect their comrades. One bomber gunner recalled, "When the Jugs showed up, you knew you were safe. They didn't fly pretty, but they flew like angels with guns." As the Allies pushed deeper into France and Germany, the Thunderbolt's reputation grew. Its 8 machine guns destroyed columns of retreating German armor. Its bombs and rockets obliterated trains and supply depots. The once proud Luftwaffe was now broken, its airfields burning, its pilots outnumbered and exhausted. By late 1944, the Germans no longer mocked the Thunderbolt, they feared its shadow. They learned to hide their movements by night because daylight meant death from above. And for the American pilots, the P-47 had become more than just a plane. It was their armor, their hammer, and their shield. It gave them the confidence to dive into battle again and again. It turned fear, both theirs and the enemy's, into respect. When the war finally began to draw to a close, the Thunderbolt stood as one of the most successful fighters of the entire conflict. Over 15,000 had been built. They had destroyed thousands of enemy planes, tens of thousands of vehicles, and shaped the very outcome of the air war. The German aces who once called it too big to fight now spoke of it differently. One Luftwaffe veteran later said in an interview, "We feared the Mustang, yes, but we respected the Thunderbolt. It was not elegant, but it was unstoppable. Respect, that was the Thunderbolt's true victory. It didn't just dominate the air. It won the admiration of friend and foe alike. And in that transformation, from laughter to fear, and from fear to respect, the legend of the P-47 Thunderbolt was sealed forever." The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt didn't begin in the skies of Europe. It began in the noisy, smoke-filled design rooms of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. It was 1940, and the world was already at war. France had fallen. Britain was fighting for its life. And across the Atlantic, American engineers knew that sooner or later, their country would be drawn into the fire. At the center of it all was a stubborn man named Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born immigrant who had fled Europe after the First World War. He had already designed the P-35 and the P-43 fighters, but this time he wanted to build something entirely different, a warplane that could survive. When the U.S. Army Air Corps sent out specifications for a new high-altitude fighter, Kartveli read them carefully and shook his head. The Air Corps wanted a small, lightweight interceptor, fast, maneuverable, and easy to produce. Kartveli disagreed. He believed the future of air combat wouldn't be about small, nimble machines. It would be about power, range, and firepower. He began sketching what would become the P-47. On paper, it looked outrageous. A fighter with an enormous engine, heavy armor, and a turbo-supercharger system that took up almost the entire rear fuselage. When he showed the drawings to his team, one engineer reportedly asked, "Alex, will it even fly?" Kartveli just smiled. "It will fight," he said. The heart of his creation was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial engine that would make the Thunderbolt the most powerful single-engine fighter in the world. But that engine needed massive airflow to keep cool. The design team spent weeks testing different cowlings and ducts until they came up with the P-47's distinctive, round nose, a shape that pilots would later nickname the Jug, short for Juggernaut. By early 1941, a prototype, the XP-47B, began to take shape. It was unlike anything the world had seen. Taller than a man, wide as a bomber wing, and weighing almost 8 tons. Mechanics struggled to believe it could even lift off the runway. The first test flight was scheduled for May 6, 1941. Test pilot Lowell Smith climbed into the cockpit, fastened his harness, and looked around. The controls were surrounded by steel plating. The view forward was limited by the giant engine. As the propeller roared to life, the entire hangar trembled. People stepped back instinctively. They could feel the power. Smith pushed the throttle forward, and the XP-47B began to roll. It needed nearly the entire runway to take off, but when it did, it climbed like a rocket. The engineers stared in disbelief. The too heavy-to-fly machine was soaring over the Long Island coast, stable, smooth, and incredibly fast. Kartveli watched silently, a cigar between his fingers, the wind blowing his coat. After years of doubt, the Juggernaut had taken its first breath. But the celebration didn't last long. The prototype had problems, many of them. The turbocharger overheated. The controls were heavy. The landing gear collapsed during testing. Yet the Army saw potential. America needed fighters, and Republic Aviation promised it could fix the flaws. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the United States was at war, and the race to mass-produce the P-47 became a national priority. The factory in Farmingdale worked around the clock. Men and women, many who had never worked in aviation before, assembled Thunderbolts by hand, piece by piece. Every rivet was a promise that America would strike back. The P-47 evolved quickly. Engineers improved its reliability, added self-sealing fuel tanks, and strengthened the wings to carry bombs and rockets. The first production models, the P-47B and later the P-47C, rolled off the lines in 1942. They were sent to England, where pilots from the 8th Air Force would soon test them in combat. When the first Thunderbolts arrived on British soil, even Allied crews were shocked by their size. "Good God! It's enormous," one RAF officer said. But when the American pilots started their training flights, they began to understand. The P-47 was no fragile speedster. It was a fortress with wings. It could take damage that would destroy any other fighter and still bring its pilot home. Kartvel's design philosophy: build it strong, build it fast, build it deadly, was proving right. The Thunderbolt could reach speeds of over 430 miles per hour and dive faster than anything in the sky. Its 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns could tear through armor, aircraft, or ground targets with terrifying precision. Yet what truly made the P-47 a legend was not just its speed or guns. It was its endurance. With the addition of drop tanks, it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, something the Allies desperately needed. And that would soon turn the tide in Europe. By late 1942, the Republic factory floor was a symphony of machinery, hammers, rivet guns, and the echoing hum of engines being tested. Kartveli often walked through the hangars late at night, looking up at rows of finished Thunderbolts lined like sleeping giants. Each one represented the future of American air power, a weapon born from doubt, fear, and vision. The juggernaut had been born, not from perfection but from persistence. And soon, it would roar across the skies of Europe, silencing every skeptic who once said it was too big to fight. Because in war, size didn't matter, but power did, and the P-47 had plenty of it. By the winter of 1944, the German war machine was breaking apart. The Allies had landed in Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pushing east through Belgium. But the Wehrmacht wasn't done yet. In the forests of the Ardennes, Hitler launched one final, desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. The skies were gray. Snow covered the ground. And for the first time in months, American pilots were grounded. Ice and fog blinded the airfields, leaving soldiers on the front lines to face the German assault alone. For 5 long days, the Allies fought in the cold and dark without air support. Then, on December 23rd, the clouds finally broke, and the sound that filled the air would mark the turning point of the battle. It was a sound every German soldier had come to fear: the deep, roaring thunder of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Within hours, hundreds of Thunderbolts lifted off from muddy runways across France. Their engines howled through the icy air as they climbed toward the front. Below them, German tanks, trucks, and columns moved along frozen roads, unaware that the storm above was coming for them. From that moment on, the Ardennes became a killing ground. P-47 squadrons swept down on enemy convoys like hawks. Their 8.50 caliber guns shredded armor. Their bombs tore apart bridges and supply lines, and their rockets left blazing trails through the snow. The German advance that had once seemed unstoppable now found itself trapped under a relentless rain of fire and steel. American soldiers on the ground watched in awe as the Thunderbolts unleashed their fury. One infantryman from the 101st Airborne later recalled, "When the jugs came in, We knew the tide had turned. You could feel the ground shake as they hit. The snow lit up like daylight. That was the sound of salvation. In one of the most famous missions of the war, the 362nd Fighter Group attacked a German column near Bastogne. In just minutes, dozens of tanks were destroyed. The Thunderbolt struck with terrifying precision, diving through flak bursts, firing until their ammo was gone, then climbing back into the clouds, engines screaming, wings scorched black. What made the P-47 so effective wasn't just its power, it was its toughness. Many returned to base with wings torn apart, engines leaking oil, or holes the size of fists in the fuselage. Yet somehow they kept flying. Pilots joked that you could shoot a jug to pieces and it would still bring you home. The Germans, however, were not laughing. Luftwaffe communications intercepted during the bulge spoke of massive Thunderbolt attacks that annihilated entire columns. One message simply read, "We cannot move by day." That was the moment when the legend of the Thunderbolt became complete. From the skies of Normandy to the fields of Belgium, the P-47 had evolved from an underestimated brute into the deadliest weapon of tactical air power. Its roar had become the soundtrack of Allied victory. Even the enemy began to acknowledge its dominance. A captured German officer told his interrogators, "When we saw the Thunderbolts above, we stopped fighting and started hiding. They were everywhere. There was no escape." By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive had been crushed. And when the snow melted months later, what remained across the countryside were the burned shells of tanks, trucks, and vehicles, all marked by the unmistakable bullet holes of the P-47's .50 caliber guns. The Thunderbolt didn't just stop the last German push. It broke the back of the Luftwaffe and destroyed the Wehrmacht's ability to fight a modern war. Its constant strikes on rail lines and supply depots left Germany bleeding from within. From dawn to dusk, the sky thundered with the sound of freedom. For the pilots who flew them, the P-47 became something deeply personal, more than just a machine. It was a friend, a savior, and a weapon that carried them through hell and back. Many gave it a name, painted on the nose: Big Chief, Lucky Lady, Sweet Revenge. Each one told a story of courage, loss, and triumph. One such pilot, Captain Robert "Bob" Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, survived being hit over a dozen times by German fire in a single mission. His plane was leaking fuel, riddled with holes and barely controllable. Yet he made it home. Later he said, "The jug never gave up. It took care of you if you took care of it." By the end of the war, over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built. They flew more than 500,000 combat sorties and destroyed over 86,000 ground targets. No other American fighter caused more damage to the German war effort. When peace finally came, the skies over Europe grew quiet again. The smoke cleared. The roar of engines faded into memory. But the men who fought beneath those clouds would never forget the sound that saved them, the thunder that rolled across the continent and ended the Nazi dream of conquest. Even decades later, veterans who heard that sound still felt a chill. One old soldier said, with a faint smile, "When I hear thunder today, I still look up, expecting to see the jugs coming to save us." That's what the P-47 Thunderbolt had become. Not just a machine of war, but a symbol of endurance, power, and victory. It was quite literally the thunder that ended them.